A sheep died in Russia 4,000 years ago. Nobody cared. It was just another animal in a Bronze Age settlement, buried, forgotten. Bones turned to dust in the southern Ural Mountains. Then in 2024, archaeologist Taylor Hermes extracted DNA from one of its teeth, and his entire team stopped working. Alarm bells, Hermes said later, immediate alarm bells. Because inside that ancient tooth, still viable after 40 centuries, was the genome of Yersinia pestis, plague, the same bacterium that killed one-third of medieval Europe during the Black Death. But this wasn't medieval plague. This was something far older. And when scientists compared its genetic signature to hundreds of other ancient samples across Eurasia, they realized something terrifying. This sheep hadn't just died of plague. It had solved a mystery that's haunted researchers for a decade. How did a disease spread across an entire continent for 2,000 years when it was genetically incapable of being transmitted by fleas? How did Bronze Age plague infect people from Sweden to Siberia, from Latvia to Kazakhstan, when the delivery system, the thing that made medieval plague so deadly, didn't exist yet? The answer was hiding in the grazing fields of ancient Russia. And what that sheep revealed isn't just about the past. It's a warning about what we're doing right now. The settlement where the sheep died was called Archaeum, a fortress city built by the Sintashta culture around 1850 BCE. These people weren't primitive herders scratching out survival. They were the tech giants of the Bronze Age. They invented the spoked wheel war chariot, mastered bronze metallurgy on an industrial scale, were among the first true horse riders in human history. Their fortress cities had circular walls 16 feet high. Their elite graves contained the earliest known chariots buried alongside warriors with bronze weapons. They were innovators, disruptors, the Silicon Valley of their era, and they accidentally triggered humanity's first continental pandemic. Here's the problem scientists couldn't solve. We know plague ravaged Eurasia between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago. Ancient DNA proves it. Human remains from Sweden to Siberia were all infected with identical strains of Y. pestis. The disease spread across 300 miles and persisted for 2,000 years. But genetically, it made no sense. Medieval plague, the Black Death, was a flea-borne nightmare. Fleas bit infected rats. Bacteria multiplied in the flea's gut, creating a blockage. When the flea bit a human, it regurgitated plague bacteria directly into the bloodstream. This caused bubonic plague. So swollen lymph nodes called buboes, 60% mortality without treatment. Pandemic-level transmission happened through rats infesting dirty medieval cities. But the Bronze Age strain, scientists call it the LNBA lineage, late Neolithic and Bronze Age lineage, was missing the key genetic mutations that allow bacteria to colonize a flea's gut. It physically could not be transmitted by fleas. So how did a disease that couldn't use fleas infect people across an entire continent for 2 millennia? How did it travel from Russian steppes to family tombs in Sweden? We have over 200 Widern pestis genomes from ancient humans, explained Edwin Harney, lead author of the sheep study published in December 2024. But humans are not a natural host of plague. That was the mystery. The plague was everywhere, but the delivery system was missing. Until the sheep. To understand what the sheep discovery solved, we need to see what this plague actually did to people. Because while scientists debated transmission mechanisms, the Bronze Age world was dying. In 2024, researchers published a study examining 108 individuals buried in megalithic passage tombs across Scandinavia between 3,300 and 2,900 BCE. These weren't ordinary graves. They were massive stone chambers, some over 52 feet long, built during the peak of the Neolithic age. The team extracted DNA from teeth and found that 17% of the dead had active Yersinia pestis infections when they died. Not past exposure, not recovered antibodies. Active, raging plague. The grim reality comes into sharp focus in one family tomb at Frälsegården, Sweden. Using genetic analysis, researchers reconstructed a family tree spanning 6 generations over 120 years. Of the 38 family members buried there, 12 died of plague. That's a 32% mortality rate, roughly equal to the Black Death 3,500 years later. The genomic evidence showed this family endured three distinct waves of disease. The first two weren't particularly deadly, but the third wave cut through them like a scythe. Multiple generations died with active infections, buried together in what must have been a desperate rush. Since the bacteria couldn't use fleas, this was likely pneumonic plague, the deadliest form where bacteria infect the lungs. Victims cough up blood filled with billions of pathogens. Anyone who inhales those droplets contracts the disease. Without treatment, death comes in under 2 days. Maria Spiro, a paleogeneticist at the University of Tübingen, noted something chilling about the burial evidence. There was a relatively high frequency of disease in this population. The fact survivors still managed to bury their dead pointed to something even more disturbing. Maybe we're only seeing the very beginning of the outbreak. And then society collapses and they're not burying anyone. This Swedish family's tragedy wasn't isolated. Between 3050 and 3000 BCE, populations across western Eurasia crashed by up to 50%. Nearly 1,000 years of population growth, fueled by the agricultural revolution, were erased in 450 years. Archaeologists call it the Neolithic decline. The timing matched perfectly with the plague findings. Megalithic construction, those massive stone monuments that had defined the age, suddenly stopped. The mega-settlement of Majdanetsky in Ukraine, which once housed 50,000 people in thousands of buildings, collapsed during this period. Other settlements were abandoned, some burned to the ground, as if people were trying to ensure whatever lurked inside would never escape. Large grain stores that could feed thousands also attracted rodents, the natural reservoir of plague bacteria. Dense populations, poor sanitation, proximity to animals created perfect conditions for pandemic spread. Some estimates suggest 5 million people died during the Neolithic decline. Relative to total population, that made it deadlier than the 1918 Spanish influenza and the AIDS pandemic combined. In some regions, population levels didn't recover for 3,000 years. For decades, archaeologists proposed various causes: climate change, agricultural collapse, warfare, general pathogen load. But without transmission, how could plague alone explain a continental catastrophe? The answer was grazing on the steppes of Bronze Age Russia. When Taylor Hermes and his team compared the plague genome from the Archaean sheep to other ancient genomes, they found something remarkable. It was nearly identical to a strain that had infected a human at a nearby Sintashta site around the same time. If we didn't know it was from a sheep, Hermes said, everyone would have assumed it was just another human infection. It's almost indistinguishable. This was the smoking gun. Humans and sheep were sharing the same disease. The question was, who was infecting whom? The answer lies in the dramatic transformation the Sintashta culture represented. Around 2100 to 1800 BCE, these people revolutionized Bronze Age life. They built approximately 23 fortified settlements, with walls reaching 18 feet high. Constructed from adobe bricks and timber frameworks, every excavated building at settlements like Sintashta, Archaeum, and Ustai contained smelting ovens and slag, bronze metallurgy on an industrial scale. Most critically for the plague, they developed mobile pastoralism on an unprecedented scale. By domesticating horses with stronger backs, specifically bred for riding, they could manage herds 10 times larger than before. With horses, they became the world's first true mobile pastoralists, covering vast territories across the Eurasian steppe. This created what researchers now call the transmission triangle. First, wild rodents, marmots, ground squirrels, voles, carried plague bacteria in their burrows without dying from it. They were the natural reservoir. Second, domestic sheep grazed across endless grasslands, coming into contact with contaminated areas or dead infected rodents. When a sheep nuzzled a carcass or grazed on contaminated grass, it could contract plague. Third, humans lived intimately with their livestock, handling wool, butchering meat, drinking milk. If an infected sheep wasn't properly butchered or cooked, humans handling the animal could contract the disease. The Sintashta Petrovka culture is famous for their extensive herding over vast pastures aided by innovative horse technologies. The study notes, This provided plenty of opportunity for their livestock to come into contact with wild animals infected by Yersinia pestis. Unlike flea-borne transmission, which requires dense urban populations and rat infestations, this zoonotic spillover model worked perfectly for mobile pastoralists. As the Sintashta people and their descendants spread westward into Europe and eastward into Central Asia, carrying their innovations in chariots, metallurgy, and language, they brought their infected herds with them. Trade networks carried livestock and animal products thousands of miles. The plague didn't need fleas to reach Sweden. It had sheep. The genetic analysis revealed one last chilling detail. The plague was evolving in real time. The LNBA lineage found in both the Archaim sheep and hundreds of ancient humans across Eurasia showed evidence of evolving under strong purifying selection. The bacterium was stripping away unnecessary genes, streamlining itself for maximum efficiency. But it was also accumulating mutations at its phylogenetic tips, the most recent infections, suggesting the bacterium was adapting to its hosts as it spread from animal to human and back again. The Swedish family burial showed this evolution in action. The 3 waves of plague that struck them over 120 years showed genetic reshuffling. Genes lost, added, or moved around in the bacterial DNA. The 3rd wave, the one that devastated multiple generations, appears to have been more virulent than the first 2. Fredrik Searsholm, co-author of the Swedish study, explained, "It's in an area of the genome where virulence is coded for. Our hypothesis is that it was more virulent over the generations. For 2,000 years, this lineage was the apex predator of the microbial world, bouncing between wild rodents, domestic animals, and human populations, evolving with each jump. And then around 1000 BCE, it vanished. The LNBA lineage went extinct. Why did a pandemic that had persisted for 2 millennia suddenly disappear? The answer likely lies in the very thing that made it successful. The Bronze Age plague had specialized so perfectly for one ecological niche, the close contact between mobile pastoralists and their sheep, that it couldn't adapt when those conditions changed, when climate shifted, when populations settled into permanent agriculture, when herding practices evolved. The transmission triangle broke. Without that specific relationship between wild rodents, domestic livestock, and mobile herders constantly pushing into new grasslands, the plague had no pathway to humans. It was an evolutionary dead end. It would take another 1,000 years for Yersinia pestis to figure out how to hijack fleas, giving rise to the bubonic plague strains that would cause the plague of Justinian in 541 CE and the Black Death in the 1340s. Those strains were descendants of a different lineage, one that had solved the flea problem and could thrive in the rat-infested cities of the medieval world. But for 2,000 years, the LNBA lineage was humanity's first continental pandemic. Taylor Hermes has received a 5-year grant from Germany's Max Planck Society to continue excavating in the southern Urals, searching for more examples of plague in animal remains. He believes this 4,000-year-old sheep tooth carries an urgent warning for our time. The Bronze Age was the moment when people in the Sintashta culture began to maintain larger herds of livestock while also riding horses well for the first time, Hermes explained. The Bronze Age plague was likely a result of that closer contact with animals and frequently moving into areas where they would be exposed to the reservoir. Sound familiar? The Sintashta people were the tech disruptors of their day. Their innovations in horse domestication and mobile pastoralism revolutionized Bronze Age civilization. They spread their technology, their language, and their genes across Eurasia. They built fortress cities and forged bronze weapons that changed warfare forever. But their economic expansion into wild ecosystems triggered the first great pandemic. COVID-19, SARS, MERS, Ebola, HIV, all jumped from animals to humans when we crossed ecological boundaries. The Bronze Age plague was perhaps the first time in human history that our new relationship with domesticated animals created pandemic conditions. 5,000 years later, we're still learning the same lesson. When we encroach on natural environments with new economic needs, there can be deadly consequences. It's important to have greater respect for the forces of nature, Hermes said. From Bronze Age sheep in the Ural Mountains to modern factory farms, the lesson remains the same. The boundary between human civilization and the wild is thinner than we think, And when we cross it carelessly, invisible killers cross back. A 4,000-year-old sheep just taught us that. The question is whether we're finally ready to listen. What do you think it means that humanity's first continental pandemic was caused by the exact same thing causing pandemics today, pushing into wild ecosystems for economic expansion? Are we doomed to repeat this cycle, or can ancient DNA teach us to stop before the next plague jumps? Drop your thoughts below and subscribe, because the deeper we dig into ancient diseases, the more we realize the past isn't just history. It's a warning we keep ignoring.